In December of 1923, three brothers named Henry, Hillel, and Herman Hassenfeld founded a small company in Providence, Rhode Island, dealing in textile remnants left over from the garment trade. The firm, registered as Hassenfeld Brothers, operated in an era when American manufacturing was still adjusting to the aftershocks of the First World War and the rapid industrialization of New England's mill towns. The brothers were the sons of immigrants, and their early business reflected the practical, low-margin trades that many immigrant families pursued at the time, buying cloth scraps in bulk and reselling them as remnants, linings, and cheap fabric goods. There was nothing in this early period to suggest that the company would one day become one of the largest toy and game manufacturers in the world. The company was formally incorporated in Rhode Island on January 8, 1926, with Henry Hassenfeld taking direct control of the corporation after Hillel departed to pursue a separate textile venture. This early period of the business is documented mainly through company retrospectives and regional business histories, and some granular operational details from these first years remain thinly sourced. What is clear is that the brothers were building, almost by accident, a manufacturing capability and a retail distribution network that would later prove transferable to an entirely different category of consumer product. By the mid-1920s, the brothers had diversified into school supplies, manufacturing pencil boxes and tin pencil cases that could be sold alongside their existing textile inventory. When their pencil supplier began competing with them by producing its own pencil cases, the Hassenfelds responded by manufacturing pencils themselves, a defensive move that pulled the company further into the manufacturing of small, mass-produced consumer goods. Through the 1930s, the firm continued to expand its line of school and novelty products, gradually moving toward items aimed specifically at children rather than at the general consumer market. It was during this period, in the late 1930s and early 1940s, that Hassenfeld brothers began producing modeling clay and simple doctor and nurse play kits, early indicators of a pivot toward toys that would define the company's identity going forward. By 1942, the business had transitioned in earnest to toy manufacturing, a shift that placed it within a small but growing American industry built largely around domestic production, regional manufacturing bases, and direct relationships with department stores and five-and-dime retailers. This transition occurred against the backdrop of wartime industrial mobilization across Rhode Island and the broader Northeast, and the specific scale of Hassenfeld brothers' own wartime production activity is not well documented in public sources, a gap this account treats as unresolved rather than filled with assumption. Once the war ended, the American toy industry as a whole began reorganizing itself around new materials, particularly injection-molded plastic, and new distribution channels that would soon include television advertising. Hassenfeld Brothers, still a regional manufacturer with modest national visibility, began to expand its catalog of children's toys through the late 1940s, competing against a fragmented field of toy makers concentrated in the Northeast and Midwest. The company's products during this period were unremarkable by later standards, consisting largely of simple plastic and wood items sold through traditional retail channels without the benefit of national marketing campaigns. This changed with the introduction, in 1952, of a toy that the company did not originally invent but chose to license and distribute, a plastic parts novelty called Mr. Potato Head, created by toy designer George Lerner. Hassenfeld Brothers acquired distribution rights to the concept and began selling it that year, marketing it initially as a set of pluggable plastic features meant to be inserted into an actual potato or other vegetable supplied by the household. The toy reportedly sold over 1 million units within its first year, an exceptional performance for a novelty item with no licensed characters, no media tie-in, and a retail price accessible to a broad swath of post-war American families. More significant than the commercial result was the marketing method behind it. On April 30, 1952, Hassenfeld Brothers ran what is widely cited as the first television advertisement for a toy aimed directly at children, a decision that anticipated the central role television would play in shaping consumer demand for the rest of the 20th century. The success of Mr. Potato Head gave the company both capital and confidence to expand its toy operations further, and it began to build the infrastructure, distribution relationships, and brand recognition that would support its growth over the following decades. 12 years later, in the summer of 1964, The company released a product that would do more than generate sales. It created an entirely new category within the toy industry. The toy was named G.I. Joe, an abbreviation of Government Issue Joe, and it was conceived as a male counterpart to the fashion doll format that had previously been considered the domain of girls' toys. Because of the cultural stigma associated with boys playing with dolls, the company and its design partners coined a new term for the product category, the action figure. G.I. Joe was sold not as a single character, but as a posable 12-inch articulated figure representing branches of the United States military, accompanied by accessory uniforms, vehicles, and equipment sold separately, a sales structure that encouraged repeat purchases beyond the initial figure. The toy was an immediate commercial success, with reported sales exceeding 16 million units by the end of its first year on shelves. Though, as with many toy industry figures from this period, some specific sales claims circulating in later retrospectives are difficult to independently verify and should be read as broadly indicative rather than precise. G.I. Joe's significance extended beyond its sales figures. It established the action figure format and the broader category of articulated, accessory-driven character toys that would become a dominant structure across the entire industry, adopted later by competitors and licensors across multiple decades. The release of G.I. Joe placed Hassenfeld brothers within a broader cultural current that, during the height of the Cold War, linked consumer products to themes of national service, military identity, and a romanticized vision of American defense readiness. For families in the mid-1960s, the toy offered children a tangible connection to a parent's or relative's military service, and its early marketing leaned heavily on imagery of honorable duty rather than combat itself. This reception grew considerably more complicated as American involvement in the Vietnam War deepened, and public sentiment toward the military became more contested across large segments of American society. Hassenfeld brothers responded by adjusting G.I. Joe's branding and accessory lines through the early 1970s, shifting emphasis away from direct combat imagery and toward adventure-oriented and exploration-themed content under variations such as the Adventure Team branding. This adjustment illustrates a recurring pattern in the company's history, in which a flagship product's public meaning shifted alongside broader national sentiment, requiring the company to recalibrate marketing and design choices in ways that were as much about reading the cultural moment as about toy engineering itself. The episode also previewed a tension that would recur decades later in different forms, between a product's commercial logic and the shifting cultural and political context surrounding it. The 1970s presented the company with a different kind of challenge. The 1973 oil crisis sharply raised the cost of petroleum-based plastics, the primary raw material for the vast majority of toy products manufactured in the United States at the time. Rising input costs squeezed margins across the toy industry broadly, and Hassenfeld Brothers, like its competitors, was forced to adjust pricing, material sourcing, and product design to manage the pressure. It was during this decade of financial strain that the company underwent a significant change in leadership and branding. The firm formally shortened its name to Hasbro, a contraction of Hassenfeld Brothers that had already been used informally for years, consolidating the company's identity under a single, more marketable name as it moved toward broader, more nationally oriented retail distribution. Leadership also began transitioning toward a new generation of the founding family, with Stephen Hassenfeld eventually assuming a central role in company strategy during this period, steering Hasbro toward a more deliberate focus on character-driven, narrative-supported toy lines rather than purely novelty or functional products. This strategic shift would prove decisive in the following decade, as the toy industry as a whole began to recognize the commercial power of pairing physical products with television programming, comic books, and other media designed explicitly to build emotional attachment to toy characters before a single unit reached a retail shelf. That recognition reached its fullest expression in 1984 when Hasbro launched two product lines that would become among the most recognized toy brands in American cultural history. The first, Transformers, was developed in partnership with Japanese toy company Takara and introduced to American audiences with an elaborate backstory developed in collaboration with Marvel Comics, supported by a daily animated television series that ran largely as extended marketing content for the toy line itself. The premise, a race of robotic beings capable of disguising themselves as ordinary vehicles, combined novel mechanical engineering in the toys themselves with a serialized narrative that gave children a reason to collect multiple figures rather than purchasing a single item. The second line, My Little Pony, took a different creative approach, building a brand around colorful, stylized pony figures supported by its own television content, and it would go on to become one of the most enduring properties in Hasbro's portfolio across multiple successive generations of redesigns over the following decades. Both product lines demonstrated a model that Hasbro would rely on repeatedly going forward. License or develop a narrative property, support it with media content largely financed through licensing or co-production arrangements, and use that narrative infrastructure to extend the commercial life of what would otherwise be a single toy purchase into an ongoing collectible ecosystem. In the same year that Transformers and My Little Pony launched, Hasbro made its first major corporate acquisition, purchasing Milton Bradley, then the nation's fifth largest toy and game seller, for a price that gave Hasbro control of an extensive board game catalog, including The Game of Life, Twister, and Candyland, along with Milton Bradley's Playskool division, which focused on toys for infants and toddlers. At the time of the acquisition, Hasbro itself ranked as the sixth largest toy maker in the country, meaning the deal effectively combined two mid-sized competitors into a company with significantly greater scale, manufacturing capacity, and retail leverage than either firm possessed independently. The acquisition gave Hasbro entry into the tabletop board game category at a meaningful scale for the first time, diversifying its revenue away from a reliance on action figures and character toys alone. The Milton Bradley acquisition established a pattern that would recur throughout Hasbro's subsequent corporate history. Rather than relying solely on organic product development, the company would use acquisitions of established, culturally embedded brands as its primary mechanism for growth, consolidating what had once been a fragmented American toy and game industry under fewer and fewer corporate owners.
That consolidation accelerated in 1991 when Hasbro purchased Tonka Corporation for approximately $486 million, a deal that brought with it Tonka's own subsidiary holdings, including Parker Brothers, the maker of Monopoly, and Kenner Products. Kenner, through a chain of prior corporate transactions originating with General Mills' ownership of Rainbow Crafts, held the rights to Play-Doh, the molding compound first introduced commercially in 1956, and subsequently absorbed into Kenner's catalog through a series of mergers in the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Kenner also held the Nerf brand of foam-based toys. Following the Tonka acquisition, Hasbro reorganized these properties internally, folding Play-Doh into its Playskool division and consolidating Nerf and other lines under the Kenner name, before eventually retiring Kenner as a standalone brand and merging its product lines fully into Hasbro by the year 2000. Milton Bradley and Parker Brothers were similarly merged into a single internal games division, and both names were formally retired as standalone brands in 2009, after 11 and 8 years of Hasbro ownership, respectively, even as the games and properties themselves continued in active production under the Hasbro name.
By the early 1990s, this sequence of acquisitions had positioned Hasbro, alongside its longtime rival Mattel, as one of the two dominant firms in the American toy industry, a duopoly structure that would persist with relatively little disruption through the following 3 decades. Among the properties absorbed through the Parker Brothers acquisition, Monopoly carried a cultural weight distinct from nearly any other Hasbro product. First published by Parker Brothers in 1935 during the depths of the Great Depression, the game built its identity around the acquisition and trading of property, rent, and capital, themes that resonated with an American public acutely aware of economic precarity. Over subsequent decades, Monopoly became one of the best-selling commercially produced board games in the world, with licensed regional and city-specific editions extending its reach across hundreds of markets internationally. Under Hasbro's ownership following the 1991 Tonka acquisition, Monopoly continued to generate licensing revenue through themed editions tied to films, sports franchises, and municipalities, a practice that turned a single board game property into an ongoing platform for co-branding arrangements with other companies. The game's specific historical origins, including disputed claims around its earliest design lineage predating the version Parker Brothers patented, remain a matter of some historical debate among game historians, and this account treats those earlier authorship questions as unresolved rather than settled. Regardless of that disputed origin, Monopoly's commercial and cultural durability under first Parker Brothers and then Hasbro ownership made it one of the most recognizable embodiments of American capitalist culture distributed through a children's product category. In September 1999, Hasbro extended its acquisition strategy beyond traditional toys and board games into the tabletop and trading card gaming sector, purchasing Wizards of the Coast for approximately $325 million. Wizards of the Coast had built its reputation on Magic the Gathering, the collectible card game it published beginning in 1993, and on its ownership of Dungeons & Dragons, the role-playing game franchise it had acquired only a year earlier in 1997. At the time, Alan Hassenfeld, then serving as Hasbro's president, framed the acquisition as a deliberate expansion into what he described as the fast-growing games arena, a category management saw as a cornerstone of the company's growth strategy heading into the new millennium. Wizards of the Coast also held distribution rights to the Pokémon trading card game at the time of the acquisition, though Hasbro would lose those rights in 2003 when the Pokémon Company assumed direct control of the property, illustrating both the opportunity and the volatility inherent in licensed intellectual property as a revenue source. The Wizards of the Coast acquisition proved to be one of Hasbro's more consequential long-term decisions, since Magic the Gathering and Dungeons & Dragons would go on to generate billions of dollars in cumulative revenue across subsequent decades, eventually becoming significant enough to Hasbro's overall financial performance that activist shareholders would later, in 2022, publicly campaign for the company to spin Wizards of the Coast off as an independent business, arguing it represented an undervalued asset within the broader Hasbro corporate structure. Parallel to its acquisitions of competing toy and game companies, Hasbro built an increasingly significant licensing business centered on entertainment properties it did not own outright, most notably through long-running agreements to produce toys tied to the Star Wars and Marvel franchises. These licensing arrangements connected Hasbro's manufacturing and distribution infrastructure to some of the most commercially successful film franchises of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, generating substantial revenue tied directly to theatrical release schedules rather than to Hasbro's own creative or marketing efforts. This model carried distinct risks alongside its rewards, since licensing revenue could fluctuate significantly based on factors entirely outside Hasbro's control, including film release delays, shifts in a franchise's cultural relevance, and the cyclical nature of blockbuster filmmaking itself. Hasbro also extended its Transformers intellectual property into a film partnership with Paramount Pictures beginning in 2007, a relationship that turned a 1980s toy line into a major theatrical franchise and reversed the more typical toy industry pattern in which films generated toy lines rather than toy lines generating films. Across these arrangements, Hasbro increasingly positioned itself not merely as a manufacturer of physical toys, but as a steward of intellectual property capable of generating revenue across multiple media formats simultaneously. As Hasbro's product lines grew in scale through the late 20th century, the physical manufacturing of its toys followed a broader trend across the American toy industry, shifting progressively away from domestic factories and toward contract manufacturing facilities overseas, particularly in mainland China, where lower labor costs and large-scale plastic injection molding capacity allowed toy companies to produce at volumes and price points difficult to sustain in domestic American plants. This shift, which accelerated through the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s, mirrored a transformation occurring across the broader American consumer goods sector, and it carried consequences both for the communities in the United States that had once hosted toy manufacturing employment and for the labor conditions inside the overseas factories that took on production. Hasbro, like other major toy companies, faced periodic scrutiny from labor and human rights organizations over working conditions, wages, and oversight practices within its overseas supplier factories, and the company responded over time by adopting supplier codes of conduct and third-party auditing programs, though the consistency and enforcement of those programs across its full supplier network has been characterized differently by company statements compared with some independent monitoring groups. This transition fundamentally altered the relationship between an American toy brand and the physical act of making the toy itself, separating the company's headquarters, design, and marketing functions, which remained concentrated in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, from the manufacturing process, which became globally distributed and largely invisible to the American consumers purchasing the finished product. The early 2000s brought a different category of disruption, as the rapid growth of home video game consoles, handheld electronic devices, and eventually internet-connected entertainment options began competing directly for children's attention and discretionary spending in ways that traditional physical toys had not previously confronted at this scale. Industry-wide, toy companies faced pressure to demonstrate that their products could compete with screens for a child's time, a pressure that pushed Hasbro toward incorporating electronic features into existing toy lines, and toward deeper integration with licensed digital and media content. The company's leadership during the 2000s, including a period under Chief Executive Alfred Verrecchia and later Brian Goldner, who assumed the chief executive role in 2008, emphasized what the company internally termed a brand blueprint strategy, an approach explicitly designed to extend Hasbro's most valuable franchises, including Transformers, My Little Pony, and Nerf, across toys, television, film, digital gaming, and publishing simultaneously, rather than treating each medium as a separate business line. This strategy reflected a broader recognition within the company that its long-term competitiveness depended less on inventing new toy categories from scratch and more on managing a portfolio of established franchises across an increasingly fragmented media landscape. Under Brian Goldner's leadership, Hasbro pursued its entertainment ambitions further through the 2019 acquisition of Entertainment One, a Canadian-based film, television, and family entertainment company for approximately $4 billion. The deal brought Hasbro direct ownership of Peppa Pig and PJ Masks, two children's media properties with substantial existing toy licensing value, along with a broader film and television production and distribution business that extended well beyond Hasbro's traditional toy manufacturing core. The acquisition represented the most significant attempt in company history to vertically integrate entertainment production directly into Hasbro's corporate structure, rather than relying primarily on licensing arrangements with outside studios, as it had with Star Wars, Marvel, and Transformers. At the time of the purchase, company leadership framed the deal as essential to securing long-term control over the content pipeline that fed Hasbro's toy lines, reducing reliance on licensing terms negotiated with external rights holders. The total price paid for Entertainment One would later prove difficult to fully recover, as changing market conditions, shifts in the children's media and streaming landscape, and broader pressure on Hasbro's balance sheet led the company toward a substantially different assessment of the asset's value within only a few years of the acquisition closing. The period surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic introduced further volatility, with global supply chain disruptions affecting toy manufacturing and shipping costs broadly across the industry, even as pandemic-era consumer spending patterns temporarily boosted demand for at-home entertainment products, including board games and toys. Brian Goldner died in October 2021 following a battle with prostate cancer, a leadership loss that occurred during a period of significant strategic transition for the company. And Chris Cox, who had previously served as president of Wizards of the Coast, was named Chief Executive Officer in February 2022. Cox inherited a company facing mounting financial pressure, with the Entertainment One acquisition increasingly viewed internally and by outside analysts as a financial burden rather than a strategic asset, compounded by broader softness in consumer toy spending following the pandemic-era surge. These pressures culminated in a series of workforce reductions beginning in 2023, when Hasbro cut approximately 800 positions, followed by an additional round of roughly 1,100 layoffs announced in December 2023, reducing the company's total workforce from approximately 6,300 employees to roughly 5,200 by the following year. Cox publicly attributed the cuts to what he described as stronger-than-expected headwinds in the broader toy and entertainment market, and the company indicated at the time that it expected difficult market conditions to persist through 2024. In August 2023, Hasbro reached an agreement to sell the eOne film and television studio business to Lionsgate for approximately $500 million, a substantial reduction from the roughly $4 billion Hasbro had paid for the entire Entertainment One company only 4 years earlier. Under the terms of the divestiture, Hasbro retained a smaller, more focused family brands division within eOne, encompassing properties like Peppa Pig and PJ Masks that connected more directly to its toy licensing business, while shedding the broader film and television production and distribution operations that had drawn the company away from its core competencies. Proceeds from the sale were directed toward paying down company debt, including a minimum of $400 million in floating rate obligations that had become increasingly costly to service as interest rates rose during this period. The eOne divestiture marked a clear strategic reversal from the vertical integration ambitions that had driven the original 2019 acquisition, with Cox and Hasbro leadership instead articulating a renewed focus on the company's traditional core: toys, games, and licensing, organized under a strategic framework the company publicly branded as Playing to Win. This framework emphasized operational efficiency, digital innovation, and a tighter focus on Hasbro's highest value franchises, including Magic the Gathering, Dungeons & Dragons, Transformers, and Monopoly, rather than the broader entertainment conglomerate ambitions the company had pursued over the preceding several years. The Wizards of the Coast division, despite its commercial importance to Hasbro's overall financial performance, became the source of a significant public controversy in January 2023, when the company proposed an update to the Open Game License, the legal framework that had governed third-party use of Dungeons & Dragons rules content since the year 2000. The proposed revision, referred to internally as OGL 1.1, would have required independent publishers and content creators generating more than $50,000 in revenue from Dungeons & Dragons-related material to report their earnings directly to Wizards of the Coast, with creators earning more than $750,000 in gross revenue facing a 25% royalty obligation. The proposal also contained provisions that critics argued would have granted Wizards of the Coast broad rights over new and original content created by third-party publishers using the open license. The announcement triggered substantial backlash within the tabletop gaming community, including a petition that gathered nearly 67,000 signatures and a wave of subscription cancellations targeting the company's digital tools, alongside public commitments from rival publishers, including Paizo, Kobold Press, and KSCM, to develop an alternative, Hasbro-independent open licensing framework. Facing sustained public pressure, Wizards of the Coast ultimately withdrew the proposed changes, left the original open game license in place, and released its core system reference document under a Creative Commons license, a resolution that avoided the most severe predicted consequences for the independent publishing ecosystem built around Dungeons & Dragons, but left a lasting mark on the relationship between Hasbro and the hobbyist community that had long supported its gaming properties. By the middle of the 2020s, Hasbro's financial recovery efforts under Chris Cox showed measurable, if incremental, results. The company reported net cost savings of approximately $40 million in the second quarter of 2024 alone, with year-to-date savings reported around $90 million, figures drawn from public regulatory filings rather than promotional company statements. Excluding the effect of the eOne divestiture, which removed a substantial revenue stream from prior year comparisons, Hasbro reported overall revenue declines in the single digits during this period, a result company leadership characterized as evidence of operational stabilization following the more severe disruptions of 2022 and 2023. The company's portfolio, by this point, had narrowed in focus but not in ambition, concentrating resources on a smaller number of high-performing franchises across its toy, game, and digital licensing segments, while reducing investment in lower-performing or peripheral business lines. Industry analysts covering the company during this period generally characterized Hasbro's situation as a disciplined retrenchment rather than a crisis, though some noted that the broader toy industry continued to face structural headwinds from declining birth rates in developed markets, continued competition from digital entertainment, and persistent pressure on retail partners managing their own inventory and pricing strategies. Considered across its full century-long arc, Hasbro's history traces a path that runs through some of the most significant shifts in 20th-century American manufacturing, marketing, and media. The company moved from a small immigrant-founded textile remnant business to a producer of injection-molded plastic toys, then to a pioneer of televised children's advertising, then to an architect of the modern toy and media franchise model, and finally to a company actively renegotiating the boundaries between toy manufacturing and entertainment conglomeration. Along the way, Hasbro absorbed dozens of formerly independent American toy and game makers, including Milton Bradley, Parker Brothers, Kenner, Tonka, and Wizards of the Coast, consolidating what had once been a regionally fragmented industry into a small number of large, vertically diversified firms. Products developed or distributed under the Hasbro name, including Mr. Potato Head, G.I. Joe, Monopoly, Play-Doh, Transformers, My Little Pony, Magic the Gathering, and Dungeons & Dragons, became embedded in the everyday experience of American childhood across multiple successive generations, functioning simultaneously as commercial products and as shared cultural reference points recognized broadly across regional, generational, and demographic lines. The company's history is not without unresolved tension. Its periodic workforce reductions, its costly entry into and exit from entertainment production through Entertainment One, its overseas manufacturing scrutiny, and its handling of the 2023 open game license controversy each illustrate the friction between a publicly traded corporation's obligations to shareholders and the expectations of the communities, both consumer and creative, that have grown attached to its brands over the decades. Whether Hasbro's current strategic focus on a narrower portfolio of high-value franchises represents a durable long-term model or a transitional phase ahead of further consolidation within the toy and game industry remains, as of this account, an open question, one that will likely be answered only through the company's performance and decisions over the coming years.